dari luar Unpad yang sudah bergabung di kelas ini, karena saya juga menyebarluaskan informasi ini keluar dari Departemen Antropologi, FISIP, dan juga Universitas Pajajaran. Jadi mungkin ada juga yang berasal dari luar lembaga kami. Selamat datang di salah satu seri kuliah dosen tamu yang kami adakan, dan hari ini kita punya tamu yang istimewa, sudah kita tunggu dari awal semester dan sekarang beliau sudah hadir. Ada Dr. Benjamin Hegarty dari University of Melbourne. Beliau ini sekarang sedang menempuh kegiatan postdoktoral di School of Social and Political Sciences, University of Melbourne. Beliau ini sebagai Mackenzie Fellow di tempat tersebut dan sudah menjalankan kegiatannya sejak 2019. Kalau kita lihat di slide ini ya, academic position-nya luar biasa ya, kita tidak ragukan lagi bahwa beliau adalah expert dalam bidang gender dan sexuality studies, dan beliau ini memiliki background pendidikan sejak dari S1 hingga S3-nya itu ada di Australia. S1-nya diselesaikan di Griffith University dengan gelar Bachelor of Art, lalu kemudian Master of Asian Studies di Monash University, dan menyelesaikan gelar doktornya di Australian National University, tempat kami dulu bertemu, dengan judul tesis yang luar biasa ya, disertasi yang luar biasa, dan beliau ini risetnya di Indonesia, di Jakarta, dan juga di Yogyakarta ya Pak Ben ya, bergabung dengan beberapa LSM yang bergerak dalam bidang HIV dan juga para transpuan. Peer-reviewed publications beliau cukup panjang dan Anda bisa lihat ya, panjang sekali ini, banyak sekali pengalamannya, dan ada buku yang akan segera terbit ya, upcoming books tentang made-up state, technology, transfemininity, and citizenships in Indonesia. Ini pasti keren sekali, kita tunggu dia bisa kita baca ya. Lalu beliau juga banyak sekali, you can see his publication, it's a long list here. Dan ini mencerminkan betapa beliau punya kajian yang sangat intensif dalam bidang gender dan juga sexuality dan juga kesehatan, karena saya lihat beliau juga pernah menjadi peneliti tamu ataupun dosen tamu di Universitas Atmajaya Jakarta. Nah, beliau juga malang melintang di beberapa kerjasama riset dalam bidang HIV di Indonesia. Tadi yang sudah hadir duluan mungkin sempat mendengarkan percakapan kami, Pak Ben baru saja pulang dari Indonesia untuk satu kegiatan riset tentang HIV. Jadi mungkin itu penjelasan singkat tentang siapa Pak Benjamin Hegarty. Sebetulnya beliau masih muda sekali, jadi bisa dipanggil dengan Mas Ben ya. Kalau di Jogja mungkin dipanggilnya Mas Ben, kalau di Bandung dipanggilnya Kang ya, Kang Benjamin. Oke. Baik Kang Benjamin, saya berikan waktu, I give you 25 to 30 minutes for your talk, and then we can just follow with questions and answer. Mahasiswa boleh menyampaikan pendapat ataupun pertanyaan dalam bahasa Indonesia, dan nanti Mas Ben akan menjawab di dalam bahasa Inggris. Begitu mungkin ya, silahkan Ben. Time is yours for the next 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Terima kasih banyak untuk kasih saya waktu hari ini untuk lecture-nya tentang Anthropology of Gender and Sexuality in Indonesia. So as Erna said, today I'm going to present in English. Saya minta maaf sebelumnya karena bahasa Indonesia saya lumayan cukup untuk sehari-hari, tetapi untuk sampaikan lecture dalam bahasa Indonesia masih agak bingung sih sebenarnya. Jadi saya minta maaf sebelumnya, saya akan menggunakan bahasa Inggris. Tetapi kalau ada pertanyaan, silakan aja dalam bahasa Indonesia, dan saya berusaha untuk menjawab dalam bahasa Indonesia ataupun bahasa Inggris mungkin ya. Jadi for today, what I'd like to do, as Erna said, I'm an anthropologist primarily by training, although I have a background in Asian studies as well. Asian studies kind of being an interdisciplinary field, but that privileges area studies or an area of expertise, a geographical area of expertise. So I was lucky enough to study area studies at both Griffith University and at Monash University, which have a fantastic history in Indonesian studies, which is where I kind of became a keen student of Indonesian studies and connected with lots of friends and colleagues since that time. So that's, you know, we can talk a little bit more about how I came to be an anthropologist who works primarily in Indonesia later on, because I am Australian and have completed all of my education in Australia. But I do have a kind of long relationship with Indonesia and Indonesian colleagues. So most recently, as Edna said, and I think that's an important aspect of my profile to mention, is that I am also a visiting researcher or visiting lecturer at P.hD, Pusat Penelitian HIV and AIDS at Atmajaya University in Jakarta. So there I've been doing lots of collaborative research with Mas Gambit, who some of you may know, or Dr. Ignatius Paharjo, as well as another colleague, Sandeep Nelmani, who works on sexual and reproductive health and education and rights and education at UNFPA. But we've been doing some research together on mostly about the role of HIV outreach workers for men who have sex with men. So penjangkau HIV untuk LSL, terutama di Jakarta. And so that research has been collaborative. It's been conducted with a team, including myself and Mas Gambit out of Atmajaya. And we've also continued to do research throughout the COVID pandemic. So while I was here in Australia, we were able to do a research project which looked at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on HIV outreach activities for MSM. And there were lots of different interesting findings related to the ways in which MSM outreach workers really kind of innovated in some really impressive ways, but also faced a lot of struggles in terms of continuing to help their clients or their patients to access medication and also to kind of connect people to testing and services. So that is basically me. I think Erna's done a nice job of introducing me. Before I start on the lecture today, and as Erna said, it would be nice to keep it relatively informal. I'll just kind of give you a brief overview of kind of the kinds of ethnographic research that I do, or how I understand ethnographic research, and then open up into a discussion. But before I begin, I just wanted to share my screen briefly so I can show you a couple of things. So for those, before I forget, so for those of you who are interested, I've started, or I'm one of the people who has started this network called the Jaringan Ethnography Terbuka, or the Network for Open Ethnography. And so the aim of this network is to make ethnographic research methods more accessible and to center collaborative forms of ethnographic research. So, you know, as students of anthropology, you'll understand the history of ethnographic research has sometimes been that of the individual or lone researcher, historically, particularly, usually a white male from a Western country, who would depart off to some far or remote location to live in a particular site, usually a small scale village or context of that sort, and would then kind of conduct various kinds of data gathering or research, you know, in the form of surveys, in the form of interviews, in the form of collecting genealogies or looking at kinship, but primarily invested in something called participant observation. So a kind of method of undertaking research or data collection where you kind of go along with people's everyday life, right? You kind of hang out with them to try and understand the world from their point of view. So anthropologists kind of privilege that method of understanding the world. But of course, what we have is a world that is extremely complicated, and that method doesn't always seem to work, right? Because sometimes, people are very complicated. They move around a lot. They're on the move. They migrate. They're in contact with the world, right, in all kinds of ways, arguably more than they have been in the past. And so what this network, as well as many other anthropologists, are kind of thinking of new ways to do this kind of research, right? Ethnographic research with a basis in participant observation in diverse and kind of complicated settings, right? Whether that be media, right? In the media, in densely populated urban settings, ethnographic work which is on the move, right? So following an object or following a group of people as they move from site to site. So this network, what we want to do is to set up a network where we look at kind of various questions of doing ethnographic research in this kind of more collaborative and more experimental mode. So if you're interested, please do register. I was going to put the, actually maybe I've got the, sorry, it's disappeared. I'll post the link to register later. Otherwise, you can if you look at P.hD Atmajaya's Twitter, they've posted it on there and they've got a link available. But after this, I'll post the link. So just to give a little bit of background as to the kind of presentation that I'm going to give today, I won't primarily focus on my own kind of work, but I want to just give you a kind of framework through which we can start to think about what ethnography means and what its methods, what are the utility or what's the usefulness of its methods for research about gender, sexuality, and health, right? So arguably we could say that gender and sexuality are crucial to understanding health, both because of the way in which people, of different genders and sexualities might think about health, might think about illness differently, right? So men and women, or warriors, or others may imagine health in a different way to one another, and may also have different kinds of health needs. Of course, that's been heightened in the context of the HIV epidemic, but we can also see the ways in which gender and sexuality are really important to the experience of the COVID pandemic as well. This, just to kind of give you a little bit more information. So here's the link to my book. Unfortunately, it's not out yet. It'll be out by the end of the year, by December. So hopefully we'll be able to share a link with you closer to the date when it comes out. At the moment, it's the 15th of December. There will be a free open access version available, so it will be available to everybody. I'm also preparing an Indonesian language version as well. So that will be published with Majin Kiri, which is a publisher that maybe some of you know. But basically, this book is based on ethnography and is based on historical research. So it combines those two things to look at the history of waria, right? Waria being one kind of category for what we might call trans femininity in English, or trans women in English, which really tries to locate them as a kind of in relation to a broader way of thinking about Indonesian citizenship, really since the birth of Indonesia. So, from the late colonial period, the 1930s onwards, you see, those who we might refer to as waria, although terms have changed over time. So Edna used another term, transpuan, which is a much more recent term that's since been created by activists, made up of the words for transgender and perempuan, right? To make a single word, transpuan. But of course, these categories have shifted and changed over time. So I was really interested in the ways in which these processes of categorization, of naming and being named, right? So the capacity to say, I'm going to demand that I'm called, right, something, waria, rather than another term, say banci being the older term that appears in the historical record. And I'm going to use this term, waria, to advocate for a position in Indonesian society, right? To claim recognition or belonging, penerimaan, or acceptance. And of course, as is the case in lots of different contexts, not everyone has always agreed to Wadia's position in society, right? So different groups, different kind of social settings have given rise to different attitudes or approaches to understanding Wadia. And the state, of course, has attempted to manage how and what Wadia meant in relation to its understanding of gender, right? Its own ideological understanding of gender that lots of great Indonesian researchers have written about. So Julia Surya Kusuma, of course, being a very famous one, right? Who's written about the state construction of femininity during the New Order as based on the figure of the Ibu, right? The Ibu and the housewife as kind of central pillars of state development. So in that context, Wadias offer a really interesting case study, I think, of the ways in which what we might call as non-conforming gender, right? So a gender that didn't quite fit within the state's scheme, right? So you had kind of men, right, taking, as a particular kind of ideological understanding of what male and maleness or masculinity and men mean, and of what femininity and femaleness or females mean. And then you kind of had Wadia emerge as a kind of distinctive category that was recognized in a kind of ambiguous way, right? Not entirely accepted, but not entirely rejected either. And in fact, able to claim certain kinds of spaces in which they were experts, right? Particularly feminine beauty. So the salon being the most important example. So that's just a brief overview of that book. Basically, it looks at the development of these categories, ethnographically, which I hope to speak about in a moment. My research has also kind of moved to medical anthropology. So I'll skip straight to this one. As well as conducting this research on the history, an ethnographic history of Wadias. So how it is that the category Wadia emerged, right, in its social context over the past 60 or 70 years. I've also done extensive work in the field of medical anthropology, particularly on matters of access to HIV treatment, testing and treatment in clinical settings among men who have sex with men. To a lesser degree, trans women as well. That's in a way how I became interested in this topic, was my work together with some different organizations in Jogja and Jakarta, who were concerned with trans women's basically increased risk of HIV, as well as their capacity to access treatment. But I then started this kind of new project, new set of research, which looked at the crucial role of peer outreach workers for men who have sex with men in Jakarta. So, what I think is really interesting and important about anthropology and ethnography is you're kind of required to have a kind of, as much as you can, a comprehensive cultural understanding, right, of a particular context. And from that context, or from that cultural understanding, you can then kind of dig into or seek to understand lots of different phenomena, right? So the phenomenon I look at in this article is that of loss to follow up, right? So loss to follow up being a kind of bureaucratic term that's used to describe, but a term that's used in everyday program language as well, that's used to describe those people who enroll in or who kind of are visible within HIV programs, so say test positive to HIV, but then don't necessarily continue in treatment, right? Or they might start in treatment, but they may drop out at some point along the way, right? 6 months later, 12 months later. And this is, of course, a big problem. It's a big focus, I think, of Indonesia's HIV program and international efforts to address HIV, because, of course, to live with HIV at the present requires consistent access to pharmaceutical treatment. Without that, it's possible to become unwell and even pass away. So, a context where you're kind of required to be in constant kind of, I guess, contact, right, or constant action with clinics, those people who kind of fall out of contact and they fall out of treatment programs are a really important focus. So in this article, I looked at the way in which really gender and sexuality, right, forms of visibility linked to gender and sexuality, as well as class, right? So how you looked to others were actually really important factors in shaping whether or not people imagine themselves as able to continue in treatment, right? So sometimes we think of gender and sexuality as kind of fixed things, right, or things that are kind of natural. But of course, the way in which gender and sexuality work take place within a cultural context. And so they're also shaped by, encounter with new or emerging kinds of concepts, in this case, HIV and its visibility. The final essay that I wanted to show, oh, sorry, I'll get that one up. Sorry, let me get it up. Is this one on the COVID-19 pandemic. So this one was that essay that I mentioned earlier, so that looked at the impact of COVID-19 on HIV outreach workers, so the way in which they were able to connect people to those services. So as I mentioned before, these really peer, often peer outreach workers or peer support workers play a really important role, right? Kind of like brokers in between the clinics and communities who are at risk of or who are living with HIV. Of course, much of that work, it takes place in person. So when various kinds of lockdown measures or public health protocols were implemented, this had a huge impact on how and in what ways HIV outreach workers could do their work. So what we really found in this essay was that lots of the work that HIV outreach workers did was in close dialogue or coordination with healthcare workers. And however, that outreach workers were not given the kind of complete recognition or placed on the same level as healthcare workers. So in a way, their role was impeded by their position, right? Or a barrier to really, I guess, fulfilling their capacity to the best of their ability was reduced by their kind of ambiguous relationship to healthcare workers. So, in a way, one of our findings would be that, in context of pandemics, but also perhaps more broadly, it's important to address HIV outreach workers as more essential than they're otherwise sometimes considered to be. And that requires lots of different considerations, things like access to adequate personal protective equipment, access to rapid antigen testing early on. This wasn't available to outreach workers, and it created lots of different feelings of exclusion, but also material consequences. So, an inability really to continue the work that they do very well. So that's basically a kind of overview of the kinds of work that I've been doing. And I think, hopefully you can see a connection between each of those. We can talk a little bit more about how it is that, how it is that anthropologists move from project to project later on. But what I might do is just go straight into this little lecture. I will keep it brief because I know we don't have huge amounts of time, but I did just want to give you a sense of the really rich history of anthropological work about gender and sexuality in Indonesia. An interesting an interesting feature of anthropology and anthropological research about gender and sexuality is that it's sometimes, is not as visible in the countries where the research takes place as outside of it. So, interestingly, in the United States and in Australia, anthropologists there are many well-known anthropologists who have done research about various kinds of gender and sexuality, right? And gender and sexual diversity, including me, right? Including my own research about Wadia. Yet in the Indonesian context, for lots of different reasons, that research is either not necessarily visible or not widely read and cited. I mean, there are lots of different reasons for that. But today I just wanted to have a kind of discussion about the way in which categories shape social worlds. So a kind of preoccupation with my in my research, as you can see, is the way that categories has been to look at how categories are not just descriptions, but that they make up our social world, right? So that the creation of a particular category at a particular time doesn't just label something as it kind of is, but it actually can change things, right? It can make up people, as a famous historian of science, Ian Hacking, has said, can make up people. That doesn't mean that certain categories are not real, right? So, you know, simple examples, of course, are categories related to gender, so male and female, or other categories as well, such as waria and transpua. To say that those are kind of made up through processes of naming and being named is not the same as to say that they're not real. So anthropologists tend to, anthropology is a very broad discipline, so I don't want to claim to speak on behalf of the whole discipline, but anthropologists tend to privilege the cultural as just as real as the biological, right? At its most, I guess, engaged with this question, anthropologists, like other scholars in the humanities, would argue that biology is also a form of culture, right? So that we can seek to unpack the kinds of language that biology uses, and we can actually understand that to be constructed, right? To be part of a kind of broader kind of set of tools for making sense of the world, for interpreting the world. So what I wanted to do was just to take you through the ways in which anthropological research, which centers participant observation, as I mentioned, and other kinds of methods, can investigate categories. And I'll give you some examples from my research in Indonesia to do that. So you'll usually, when you show Australians, is kind of not, they're sometimes not quite familiar with different parts of Indonesia. You will be very familiar. But my own research has taken place mostly in Jakarta and in Jogja, which is actually not on this map, funnily. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the kinds of research that have been done throughout the Indonesian archipelago on gender and sexuality, and particularly South Sulawesi, so this place here. So some of you may be aware of the fact that in different parts of Indonesia, there are different kinds of ways of expressing gender difference. So one example is the Bugis of South Sulawesi, who have been the subject of lots of different interesting forms of research, and also kind of various kinds of artistic production as well. So among the Bugis, what we can see, and in Bugis culture, you can see that we have a different set of terminologies for understanding gender, right? Or categories for thinking about gender. And these have been categorized by Sharon Davies as 5 genders, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that, the Bugis people themselves understand themselves as having 5 genders. Maybe some do, right? But this is an anthropological interpretation of Bugis cultures, right? And it's basically, conducted by Sharon, this anthropologist, Sharon Davies, going and living among kind of Bugis communities for an extended period of time, noting down the kinds of categories that people use to talk about themselves and others, and then coming back from that location and then kind of synthesizing it, right, into a theory of how gender is understood. And I mean, in a way, this is a system that makes sense. You've got these 5 categories, Makunrai and my pronunciation is terrible, Oroane, right, as male and female, what we might call as cis men and cis women, and I'll introduce a little bit as to what cisgender might mean in a moment. You've then got chalabai and chalalai, which Sharon has kind of articulated as male femininity or female masculinity, but which we might also call forms of trans femininity or trans masculinity as well. You've then got this kind of additional category, right? And I think each of those will be probably familiar with most people here. But what's kind of distinct about Bugis is that there is an additional category, the bisu, right? And so the bisu are a kind of spiritual or ritual practitioner who is not necessarily gendered in the sense that we might think of that term as an individual identity, right? That speaks to perhaps who you are, or that it speaks to your role in reproduction, right? So that you're kind of positioned within a kind of form of reproduction in society that genders you. It's not really those things, but rather it's a relationship to ritual practices that are linked to a broader Buddhist kind of cosmology, right? That gives this category its meaning. So one question that we might ask is whether bisu is a gender, right? And I think that's an interesting question that we might kind of discuss later on. You know, is bisu a gender? And there's been wide debate in anthropology about whether the kinds of things that we sometimes call gender are in fact genders at all, right? So as I said before, bisu don't necessarily have a kind of identity, right, in the sense that we might think of that as a modern term, but rather they perform particular roles, right, under certain conditions. So in that sense, being a bisu is a little bit like a position in society, a job, right? A job is a weird way to put it, but you know, something like a role in society that you perform under particular conditions, right? But on the other hand, it's not really a job in the sense that, you know, I'm a university lecturer or known as a university lecturer, right? And when we leave or we go home for the day, we kind of, that's not our primary role. We might also be, you know, a partner, right, to somebody. We might be a husband or wife, we might be a brother or sister, right? We might take up these different kind of positions in relation outside of our profession. Bisu instead is, as I said, it's a kind of ritual practice, right, related to broader cosmology. So it kind of positions Bisu as in a sacred position in that society. So as we can see, you know, calling Bisu a gender is a little bit tricky, right? Because gender comes, even the category gender comes with a lot of meanings, right, and assumptions that we bring with us, you know. So I think it remains a really interesting question to ask, right? Is Bisu a gender? And we might discuss that later on. So here we have some quotes from Sharon's book that kind of, you know, give us a sense of the complexity of describing Bisu according to a kind of theory that is grounded in gender. So Sharon says that only an individual who embodies the energy of both male and female is powerful enough to contact the spirit world, right? So that's how I guess she's seeing them as gendered. So they're gendered in the sense that within Buddhist cosmology, maleness and femaleness kind of are considered sources of power. And so to be able to unify those makes you a particularly powerful person, right? This is a very, you know, unfamiliar understanding of gender, right? As far as you know, I've been brought up with, right? I can imagine that many of you as well. And that also Bisu are considered to comprise both male and female elements, but this can be a symbolic composition rather than a biological one. So here Sharon is kind of saying that, you know, there's kind of a composition of female and male elements, but that on the surface of the body, that this is important on the surface of the body, kind of like in a sense, like a performance of sorts. Not to say that it's not real again, but rather that those symbols are kind of drawn upon to assert a kind of position in society. Again, quite a distinct set of understandings to that which we usually understand about gender. So when we're thinking about gender, often in Australia, also in Indonesia, right, we're often thinking about the natural role that's assigned to men and women, right, the kind of position that they're assumed to take, and that it has lots of characteristics, right? It might be consistent, right? It might predispose you to particular behaviors, right, that are understood as natural. Not that those behaviors will be always the same, but it will predispose, men and women to different kinds, masculinity and femininity, to different kinds of behaviors and traits. It will also align with particular ideals, right, about what men and women should do. So according to that kind of understanding of gender, right, gender as kind of coming from your kind of, I guess, biological or natural basis, that it's kind of stable, right, and that it's linked to not to other sources of energy, right, like a kind of cosmology or a kind of spirit world, but it kind of it's self-sustaining, and that it comes from you, or it is in relation to other humans. This is a very distinct understanding, isn't it? Very different kind of understanding. So that's not to say that we shouldn't call a bisu a gender, right? It's just that we might ask, what is it when we call bisu a gender, right? Does it change what bisu means? In turn, does understanding the bisu as a gender help us to think about our understanding of gender differently as well, right? So actually, the kinds of examples I gave before, that, for instance, I'm a university lecturer, and that's not stable all the time, right? That depends. The primary context in which I am will depend on where I am. That's true in Western contexts, but it doesn't really apply to gender usually, right? Your gender is imagined as stable. So why is it that we think, in turn, that we might imagine gender as stable or continuous, right, with a single individual? That's the kind of questions that anthropologists will get to, right, through this kind of cross-cultural analysis, right? So you would ask questions of what is it to call bisu a gender, and then you might use that, right, to think about what does bisu tell us about our conception of gender, right? So it would kind of be a two-way traffic in a sense. What I wanted to do was just play this little film, because I've talked a little bit about, sorry, that is no longer available there. Just so you get a sense, right, of the kind of distinctive ways in which, here we go. I'll just play the brief trailer from this film, if that's okay, which I think will give you, a nice sense. So this is a film by a great Indonesian filmmaker called Kiki Febrianti. You'll be able to look up the film, kind of the full film later, I hope. But basically, this is a film where Kiki has gone out and kind of, engaged in a kind of visual anthropology of chalalai, who also, take on kind of these aspects of ritual practitioner in the bisu context. So when we're watching this movie, I'd like you to just think about those questions that I asked, right? What is it to just describe chalalai as a gender? What does that mean, right? Is it a gender, right? Or is it something else? Is it a job, right? Is it? Then also, think about what does that tell us about our own understandings of gender, right? So all those things I mentioned earlier, that we imagine gender as something stable, right? That it's natural, that it's assigned to male and female, right? That there are two, for instance. So just think about those two questions as you watch this film. Now, sorry, I'll just stop that, and I will quickly go to the other one. Can everyone hear that okay? Hear it? Mm-hmm.
Not yet.
I might just start again so we can.
If you click the share sound button, so you can hear the sound.
You can hear it okay?
Cannot hear the sound yet.
Great. Could you hear that okay?
Not yet. We can hear the sound. Maybe you just click the share sound at your Zoom application.
Sorry.
Yeah. When
where
you
is
click
the
the
share
green
sound?
button,
Sorry.
when you click the green button, it should be on the left, bottom left.
The share screen?
Share sound.
Share sound, got it.
Yeah,
Sorry. Sorry, I'll play that again.
Left corner. Yeah.
Oh, it's telling me to install something. Sorry, just hold with me for 1 minute. Okay. Can you hear that?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, you can hear that?
Yeah.
Great, okay. Let me go back to the start. Sorry. It's very short, so hopefully it'll be fine.
Mama sawe Hegarty satu lani lagaligo.
Yana awak hek dewa ta. Yana yana nang. Erko mak boke anger bakun raya. Nyamra ke anu dek to masak di pakai bisu ki, pakai makun retomi asan.
Kuna ero jiwa, kuna ero kasi antara makunrei dengan burani.
Jadi maksudnya untuk bilang laki-laki perempuan yang mau ke laki-laki ya, itu mungkin memang ada yang kejiwaan memang begitu. Tapi kalau saya pribadi tetap lebih dominan ke tetap sebagai wanita, sebagai perempuan.
Great.
Sesi tanya jawab.
Thank you. So basically, so some of the features that strike me in that little film, that's the trailer, right? Or the short preview of the film. Though I would recommend watching the whole film, it's very special. But we can identify a few different things, right? A few differences, for instance, in how gender might be understood, right? So we can see the way in which certain ritual practices are really important, right? Certain objects, right? So say possessing a particular kind of sword, right? Or ritual blade might be related to someone's position. That also might be shaped by an understanding that dressing in a particular way, right, might be seen to bestow someone with certain kinds of power, right, or ritual power in certain contexts, right? It's not like this is kind of an everyday condition, right, that you're engaging with, that you're always called upon to be this way, but rather that under certain conditions, right, you might perform this role. But in terms of similarity, what's interesting is that we can see, both the filmmaker as well as some of the people that Kiki is talking to use terms like masculinity and femininity, right, maleness and femaleness, to refer to that combination of elements, right? So the way in which kind of chalalai or bisu draw upon different kinds of symbols to articulate that position, right? So what's of course interesting is just to ask, what does masculinity and femininity mean in that context, right? So the kinds of presentation in the film, in fact, to me, are fairly androgynous, right? They don't strike me as particularly masculine or particularly feminine necessarily, right? In the way that I might imagine gender. So we might ask as well whether masculinity and femininity are even good categories, right? Or good terms that we can use to describe this practice. Let me just finish up by talking a little bit about my own research. So I've got some comments down there, but let me just wrap up with this. So we can also share similar kinds of perspectives, right, as to what gender means, not only, as I said, in kind of distinctive kinds of localized forms of tradition, but also in more national understandings of what gender means. And I mentioned that my research has been concerned for some time with waria or transpuan, but we might think about waria and transpuan, right, as not necessarily localized kinds of traditional terms, right, but they're really Indonesian national terms, right? So waria and transpuan are not terms that are, or words that are used in, say, Australia or even in Malaysia or even in Singapore, really, but they extend to the boundaries of the Indonesian nation, right? They're used in the Indonesian language, right, in the Indonesian vernacular, and they'll appear in the dictionary, right? I don't know if transpuan is already in the dictionary, but waria and certainly the older term wadam are in the dictionary. So you can see that these are kind of part of in a sense, a national culture, right? They're recognizable as part of a national culture. Now, of course, how and in what ways they're accepted as part of that national culture remains to be seen, right? But ultimately, I think that among many warias themselves, they would imagine themselves as a part of Indonesian society, right? Or as at least striving for inclusion or acceptance. Penerimaan oleh masyarakat, right? Mau diterima oleh masyarakat are the two turns of phrase that are used very often among waria. So these are just photos from field work that I've undertaken in Jogja. This is from the International AIDS Day in 2014, I believe, with Mami Finolia Wakijo from Jogja, who's a very famous.
That's Mami Finolia.
Yeah, a famous waria leader who set up an amazing shelter for people living with HIV in Jogja. And this is kind of some warias in one part of the city where waria commonly live. Generally, these are poorer or economically disadvantaged waria. And here we are kind of doing a survey, right, with members of an NGO to look at how many waria are excluded from KTP, right, the state identity card at that time. There's been lots of interesting kind of focus on transgender access to KTP over the past couple of years. And I think the Dukcapil and the Kemendagri have all kind of in different ways articulated that they will do outreach for waria and other marginalized communities to access KTP. So that's that. But basically, what I wanted to end on today was really to think about the relationship between, sorry, let me just go back. So I want to think about that question that I raised earlier, and this is a kind of concern that we or comment that we can then lead into a discussion. But this was a very common way in which people narrated their process of becoming waria to me, right? Jadi waria is the way in which they described it. They described it as a process, right? They described it as a process of starting out. And this is one person, but this was a generally common narrative that was told to me. And it's by no means, though, the only way in which transpuan or waria will understand themselves. But this was a common one as it was narrated to me. And I think it's important to reflect on what this means, what what this kind of narrative, a shared narrative indeed, means for our understanding about gender. So this person said to me, we start out as gay mondek, and then we become banci kaleng, and that we only become complete or perfect as a waria, sempurna sebagai waria, when we meet other waria in salons and at tempat nyebong, right? So engage in the spaces in which waria undertake transactional sex and social life, and perform dendong or dandan, right? So dandan being kind of the act of making yourself up. So what's interesting about this kind of narrative, and it was repeated lots of different times, is again, it doesn't really suggest, gender as a kind of stable or innate or natural thing, right? It suggests that it's something that can be changed or transformed through human action. So what this requires, I think, is kind of close attention then to the kinds of spaces, right? The kinds of relationships and the kinds of forms of embodiment that make that gender legible to others. So in other words, what I think is really interesting about this is how, similar to in a way, the studies of Bisu, this kind of understanding or the practices of what we might call gender among Bisu, right? The kind of possession of particular sacred objects, right? Or the transformation of your appearance under particular conditions. This understanding really pushes back against some idea that gender is always something which is very stable, right? Which is bounded at the individual or the product of an individual, and that it's consistent, right, throughout an entire life, right? That it will necessarily be consistent across an entire life. I think this reminds me, at least, of the way in which gender is really shaped by lots of different things, right? It doesn't really stand alone. Gender is shaped by economic class, right? So, that goes certainly for warias, but it also goes for men and women too, right? So what masculinity or femininity mean if you're a kind of middle or upper class person, in the upper classes or middle classes, will mean something very different if you're from an economically disadvantaged group, right? Or if you live in kind of remote part, say, of Indonesia. So I think, with that in mind, again, what does this tell us about how we understand the category or concept of gender, right? How can we be more attentive to understanding gender as it takes place across different kinds of contexts, right? As it means different things to different people. What are the methods that we might use, right? What might we look out for if we are anthropologists and we put our kind of ethnographer's hat on? What kinds of things do we need to pay attention to, right? So that we don't just take our assumptions into the field with us and kind of identify, that this is either a man or a woman. They have particular kinds of characteristics, right? So we don't do that, right? So we don't just automatically kind of take our universal assumptions with us when we go into the field, but we can be more closely attentive to life as it's lived. My argument would be that it's ethnographic research, right? It's forms of close attention and listening to people and observing their kind of everyday settings in which they live that will lead us to a kind of better understanding of what gender actually means in social worlds. So I think with that, hopefully that was clear. If you've got any questions, hopefully I'll be able to answer them. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, for the lovely talk. It's very inspiring and also a lot of new knowledge for the students, especially when you talk about how gender is a fluid concept and also depends really on the social and cultural situation or context. Like here in Bandung, we only know that gender will be associated with feminine and masculine, but in Bugis context, it can be both or none of them. That's very interesting. Yeah, maybe we can just start the question and answer for students. We have one comment in the chat, and probably students can raise their hands and ask their questions directly, either in Indonesian or in English. Do you want to comment on this? From P.hD Siswanto. He is a postgraduate student in anthropology. I think this is also interesting comment.
Yeah, please. Eddie, would you like
Eddie.
to tambah atau?
Saya pakai bahasa Indonesia aja ya.
Boleh,
Ya,
boleh,
silakan.
silakan.
Maaf ya, saya tidak menggunakan bahasa itu.
Ya, nanti saya bantu kalau Ben nggak ngerti ya.
Ya, siap. Soalnya pakai bahasa Inggris agak lama juga saya ngetiknya tadi. Ya, menurut saya memang sangat menarik ya fenomena gender di Bugis ya. Ada kalalai ya. Tapi menurut saya itu lebih ke arah masalah psikologis sebetulnya. Dan jeniusnya gitu ya, budaya Bugis ataupun mungkin Indonesia ya, menanggapi hal-hal yang psikologis itu dengan lumrah gitu ya. Bahkan memberikan solusi, makanya muncul kalalai. Ya, ada kalalai, mungkin ada waria gitu ya. Kita sendiri kalau lihat waria juga nggak begitu takut kan sebetulnya ya. Karena kita menganggap itu sebagai fenomena psikologis saja. Tapi kalau kita menganggap itu sebagai fenomena seksualitas, nah itu baru menjadi hal yang menakutkan. Jadi baik waria atau tomboy girl atau kalalai atau sebagainya, kita nggak merasa asing sebetulnya karena kita menganggap itu sebagai hal yang psikologis. Dan tapi kalau lain halnya dengan homoseksualitas ya, homoseksualitas itu hal yang berbeda menurut kami, dan itu yang agak bertentangan dengan keyakinan kan gitu ya. Tapi kalau sebagai fenomena psikologis itu hal yang nggak apa-apa gitu, bahkan ngasih solusi seperti sebutan waria itu atau sebutan gadis tomboy atau mungkin kalalai atau apa, itu adalah solusi dari orang Indonesia sebetulnya, baik secara modern ataupun secara tradisional ya. Artinya kita menerima kalau itu sebagai gejala psikologis. Tapi kalau sebagai suatu gejala seksualitas, mungkin itulah yang masih rancu ya, yang akhirnya kami mungkin ya beberapa dari orang Indonesia tidak menerima itu. Ingin segera komentar saja.
Oke, terima kasih Pak Edi. So what do you think, Ben? Is it a psychological issue or just whatever?
I mean, this is interesting. I think because, if we look at, the recent kinds of work in transgender studies, right? Or the study of transgender, right, as a phenomenon that has been medicalized, but actually, nowadays is being demedicalized in lots of ways. There is a concept of gender identity, right? Identitas gender, right? So that, and in a way to articulate what trans means, or what trans means, that has been common in the past is and still relatively common, is in Western cultures, so often in contexts like the US or Australia, is that trans people are experiencing the wrong body, right? They're in the wrong body, right? So that, say, a waria has a female gender identity, but she's been assigned a male at birth, right? And therefore, what she needs to do to kind of is to align herself, right? And so that her psychological gender or gender identity is more aligned with her appearances, right? And so that she'll be gradually accepted, right? So her social gender will be accepted as such, right? And she'll navigate Indonesian society, accepted as a woman, right? Or like a woman. What's interesting about Indonesia is that, as you say, Eddie, that when it comes to, say, waria are fairly well accepted, I would say, in Indonesia, relatively speaking, not always and not in all conditions, but have historically managed to achieve a kind of acceptance, even though they're not, in a sense, passing as women, right? They're not saying, and very few Indonesians would recognize, say, warias as women, right? As the same as women. I think that would be very rare, in fact. But what's interesting is the way in which waria have kind of become accepted as in a sense, kind of, a kind of category on their own, right? But which is based, as you say, more on this concept of having jiwa perempuan, and then, berdandan sebagai perempuan supaya, ternampak, jiwa perempuannya ternampak, or terlihat. That's the kind of concept that warriors will articulate. And that's understood really as an opportunity to obtain a kind of position within society, right? It's a challenging position. It doesn't always achieve full acceptance, but under certain conditions it does. So it's an interesting question as to, why it is that that's the case. Whereas, as you say, when it comes to sexuality, if someone was to, say, articulate their sexuality as, as gay or as homosexual, that wouldn't be, you wouldn't face the same kind of degree of, I guess, degree of acceptance, right? At present, at least, that's not the case. So in Indonesia, you do have this interesting kind of distinction, right, made between gender and sexuality, which I think is an important one to understand.
Menarik ya Pak Edi ya, sudah dijelaskan barusan. It's very interesting. Yeah, we have a lot of questions coming up at the chat, so we have to be quick. But that's another question from Danny.
Makasih.
Ya,
Makasih
sama-sama.
Pak Edi. Terima kasih. Danny, do you want to post your questions right away, or should I read from the chat? Danny, are you here? Danny?
Boleh.
Ya, oke. Oke, saya bacakan saja ya. Oke. Ben, Danny asking about this. I don't think all Indonesians who think of themselves as warrior or transpuan have the confidence or the courage to speak up. So his question is, how do you research a group of people who tend to hide from society or don't want to be exposed? From your own experience, what were the challenges and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I mean, it goes to this question of I guess research ethics in a sense, and also our relationship to people that we research, right? So I guess for me the question becomes, what are the research questions that might matter to them, right? What are the research questions that might matter to waria or transpuan? What are the organizations that they have, right? And what transpuan or waria researchers are there, right? If there are any. And I think, there are certainly waria and transpuan researchers, or they struggle with different kinds of adversity in the Indonesian, in contexts more generally. So the first thing I think to say would be to think about what are the conditions that mean that people are perhaps less willing to engage with certain questions. Another might be to think about like what kinds of questions have been asked before, what kinds of research has been done before, and how is that research framed waria or transpuan, right? Has it framed them just as victims, right, of particular kinds of conditions? Has it identified the kinds of agency that they have? Does it align with what they want from research? What do they see as the role of research, right, to begin with? These are all, I think, really interesting and important questions that anthropologists and all researchers actually kind of grapple with. So those are the kinds of questions that I would start with. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Maybe Danny, you can join Ben's talk in the next Thursday, or when he talk about ethnographic research, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So that will be really interesting because we've got a representative from Suara, which is a transpuan organization in Jakarta, who will talk about their experience of being a subject of research, and what research has meant to them, right? I think this is a really important question, and this need not only be limited to transpuan, right? Lots of people are subjects of research, but aren't always necessarily involved in the research process, right? Or understand what becoming a research subject means. Erna might, have spoken about, her experiences during fieldwork, right? And And I think, lots of anthropologists will be familiar with this question, right? Like, what is it to study a group of people who are, on the one hand, maybe don't want to be researched, right, for good reasons, or are over-researched, right, who have had people kind of coming to them time and time again, asking them to tell the same story, right, without ever seeing the results of the research or getting any benefits themselves. So I think that, these are the kinds of questions that are really interesting to me at the moment. So on Thursday, we're going to talk about that quite a bit.
True. Ya, Dani dan mahasiswa yang lain bisa join ya nanti di kelasnya Pak Ben tentang how to do ethnographic research. Ini menarik karena tantangan-tantangan untuk riset biasanya akan dibahas di sana. Okay, we go on to the next questions because we have 3 more and hopefully it will be answered all. So, pertanyaan dari Fiska ya. I read one of your studies investigating the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on male community-based outreach workers who have sex with men in Jakarta. What attracted you to this theme? And how did the local community respond when they found out that you were doing this research?
Yeah, great question again, and I think goes to this question of Danny asked earlier. So this research came out of, I've been doing this research for some time now, and along with, as part of a team with Mas Gambit from P.hD and Sandeep Kanwani from UNFPA. And basically we'd been doing research since 2017 with one organization for organization of outreach workers for men who have sex with men. We've done research on their relationship with healthcare workers and relationship with puskesmas, particularly at the puskesmas level. So basically when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, Sandeep was here in Melbourne, and so was Mas Gambit actually. And we discussed, the kind of research that we could do, and we decided it would be interesting to try to track the impact of the pandemic on outreach services in Jakarta, because obviously what we saw was a massive disruption in lots of ways. Everyone would have experienced this, some disruption to life. So we wanted to see, what kind of impact was the COVID pandemic having, what kind of impact would it have, and what support or further support could be given to outreach workers. So in the case of this research, what we did was we presented it to although I had a good relationship already with the organization, we presented it to them, we got their feedback on the kind of research design, and then we did the research, entirely online. Although Amalia, who's also an author and who I work with, Amalia Handayani at Atmajaya, was in Jakarta. We all did the research online because of COVID. And so we did lots of different kinds of methods, interviews, very familiar methods to any qualitative researcher, lots of interviews. We also did video diaries where people would kind of, reflect on their experience of the past week to a video. And then we did a series of focus group discussions where we introduced the findings of the research to our participants and invited them to respond, right, to fill in the gaps, to contest the findings, right, to ask different kinds of questions to that which we asked. In the end, what I did before publishing this study was translate a summary of it and send it to the director of the organization to get his input and advice. This is a step in research that not everybody takes necessarily. And I think it's an interesting question, right, as to how and in what ways you involve your participants in the process of disseminating the research findings, right? Ultimately, for me, I think it's really important to do that because there's lots of different things that you might not be aware of as a researcher, right? Lots of different kinds of politics, I guess, that you need to pay attention to. So in that case, I brought it to the director at this organization. We discussed it, I presented it to them, and then we published the study. So it's a very intensive process. And as you can see, one really important thing about it doesn't need to be only anthropological research, but one cool aspect or interesting thing about ethnography is usually it is committed to an ongoing relationship with your research participants, right? You don't just see them as kind of out there, but you may become friends with them, right? You may actually, develop a lifelong relationship. And so what that means is that you have a really great opportunity to involve people right the way through the research process, not just, as subjects of data, right? That you kind of march out to the field and you gather up the data and off you go and they never see you again. Not like that, but rather that you would invite them to kind of participate in the process of analysis, look at the questions that you ask, and then even right through to the publishing process. So the Jaringan Ethnography Terbuka is actually trying to take this one step further, right? To think about how ethnography can involve people at all stages of the research, and particularly the people who are subjects of research. That's basically, sorry, that was a long-winded way of putting it, but that's the kind of process that I'm thinking about now.
Thank you, Ben, for the very clear explanation. But do you think you still have time, because we're already in 1:45?
Yeah. That's okay. Let's give five minutes more.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
Because we still have a lot of questions here.
Yeah.
This one is very interesting because she's asking about, it's from Kafila. Kafila, she's asking about whether the binary concept on gender, feminine, masculine, comes from the colonial time or the concept of the colonialism instead of the local concept, because in the case of Bugis, there are a lot of gender, not only feminine and masculine, but also combined of both, or maybe none of them. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I actually have another slide which I didn't have time to go into, but discusses exactly this question. So some anthropologists, and there's a really great essay, I'll copy it and paste it for you if you're interested. Let me just
Yes, please.
I remember. Yeah, this one by Evelyn Blackwood. And this is what Evelyn Blackwood has to say about this particular question. So during the colonial period, the mythologies of sacred gender, so that's what she calls sacred gender, and that means bisu, right? These kinds of forms of gender presentation that have a connection to ritual practices, within a much broader kind of encompassing understanding. Mythologies of sacred gender were subsumed or replaced by a mythology of innate gender, reduced to human form. So that's kind of what I described before, that process of individualization that we think about, right? That gender is something that each and every individual holds, and that is it P.hD or P.hD before described. I think I did. Yeah, P.hD. That's right. He asked the first question, and he described a kind of similar way of framing gender, right, in terms of psychology, right, or psychological identity. And we might describe that as a kind of a modern framework to describe gender, right, as a kind of psychological or medical, right, or social scientific method or behavioral method of describing what gender means, which is also part, I guess, of a process of defining gender in terms of individuality. So in any case, what Evelyn Blackwood says is that doing this, right, reducing gender to its, being the property of one individual, it divests it to a large extent of its magical powers to unite the cosmos. So that I think is the really important point there. So basically, Evelyn Blackwood is saying that pre-colonial forms of gender and sexuality did not have that meaning, right? They weren't limited to this highly individualized sense of gender as something innate that you are, right? It's a matter of being, but rather that gender was understood much more along the lines that we saw in that film, right? Or that I've described in the context of say the bisu, right? Or chalalai or chalabai, right? In that particular context. And so that the influence of colonial forms of power, right? Colonial forms of understanding, colonial norms, right? Around what it means to be civilized or not civilized, as well as kind of, the emergence of modern religions, monotheistic religions, which have particular concepts of gender, did shape gender, right? Did influence gender. I think that's undoubtedly the case. What the results were is then another question, right? Did you end up, my preference is probably to say it didn't mean that this understanding of gender disappeared, right? Because obviously they're still there, right? We have bisu, we have other kinds of gender waria, right? For instance, different ways of thinking about gender differently. So what it seems to me is that you've got these different ideas about gender going on at the same time, right? The question is which one becomes more dominant or which one becomes less dominant over time will shift. But I think that's such a great question that we really need to understand a much bigger picture of what's going on, right? A much broader process of what's going on when we think about gender. We can't just limit it to the individual alone. Otherwise, we're going to miss a lot, right? A lot in terms of social transformation or change over time.
Oke, thank you Ben. Kafila, semoga puas ya dengan jawabannya, menarik sekali. Jadi harus lihat konteksnya juga ya, bukan hanya kolonialisme saja yang membuat ada binari tentang konsep tentang gender, tapi juga lihat socio-cultural konteks yang terjadi saat itu. Kemudian next questions from Nadia. What is the main reasons or main factor for most people to reject waria or transgender? Do you have any information about this based on your research?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think that, as I said before, what's really interesting in the Indonesian context is that under some conditions, and this has been the case, this is still the case today, although today it's possibly a little more challenging for different reasons, but certainly throughout the New Order, right, in the 1970s, 80s, maybe a little bit in the 90s, that actually waria could be very well accepted, right, in particular contexts. So it wasn't as though, waria would be comfortable at all times, right, in all settings, but rather that under certain conditions, right, in certain settings, and the salon being a really famous one, right, that waria were able to achieve a kind of high degree of acceptance, right, or recognition of their social role. So the reasons as to why waria are not well accepted across all settings is a really important and complicated question. My sense is that it has something to do with how citizenship is understood in Indonesia as a kind of form of status, right, related to your presentation across different settings, right, and that your appearances matter a great deal in terms of defining your social role or your social class. So the reason why waria are not accepted across all settings is probably, how should I put it? It's such a complicated question. It's a simple question, but a hard one to answer.
You need a deep research to answer this question, right?
That's right. If you read my book, hopefully you'll find out precisely what has gone on over the past 50 or so years. But good news, right? If we focus on the other way, acceptance, that waria have really been able to achieve a degree of acceptance that is a great deal more than what it was in the 1950s, for example. So waria really fought hard to be able to achieve a position in society. I think for most people, I do think or most contexts, the problem comes with not with waria themselves. I don't think it's their fault, but it's rather how gender is defined, right, or what gender is defined to mean. And I think at times waria do come into conflict with what those dominant ideas about gender are, right? So that male and female, men and women have particular kinds of social roles, that they dress in a particular way, that they have a particular kind of comportment, way of speaking, demeanor. Warias don't necessarily align with some of those social expectations. And I think that leads to situations where they're viewed as not belonging, really, not belonging in particular contexts. So yes, I think I'll leave that at that. But if you have a look at my website, you'll find the link to my book, and you'll find links to different articles. If you have any trouble accessing them, let me know. I can send you all of the PDFs of those very easily. Sorry, let me. But basically, I think this is a really understanding the place of warias in society, like understanding the place of other minorities, can tell us a lot about what dominant ideas about the nation are, about citizenship is, right? And how ultimately we can make a more just and equal society for everybody. I think these remain really important objectives of anthropology more broadly. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Ben. There are still maybe 5 questions left here. Do you mind I read them for you, or?
I should probably head off shortly. Let me just see if my meeting is happening.
What time is your next meeting?
Sorry, my meeting should be at 5. So I probably should head off if that's okay.
Okay.
Yes, probably should wrap it up if that's okay. My apologies.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had a little confusion with the time.
I
think it was between. Yeah, I think it was between me being in Indonesia and putting it in my calendar, and then the time changing in my calendar.
Yeah, I know. Sorry,
apologies. No. That's totally my fault. I'm so sorry.
Okay. Probably for the questions here, which is not answered in this session, I can just give it to you by email or maybe by other media, so you can answer it in written version.
Yeah, of course.
What do you think about that? So everybody will be satisfied with that.
Of course. Yeah, my pleasure. And there might be similarities between some of them, so I can group together different answers. But yeah, happy to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. Bagi para mahasiswa dan juga peserta yang belum bisa terjawab pertanyaannya, karena banyak sekali, we still have 5 more questions living there. So maybe saya akan kirim ke Mas Ben via email dan nanti jawabannya akan saya share ya. Mohon maaf sekali karena beliau memang ada jadwal yang lain di pukul 2, jadi tidak memungkinkan untuk menjawab semua pertanyaan. But this is great because the audience really listening to your talk and they have a lot of questions in their mind. Jadi nanti bisa dijawab secara tertulis ya. And also probably we can just arrange another lecture for you next semester. So people will be happy to listen to your talk and also satisfied with their questions who are not answered this session can be answered next time. Yeah,
of course. Happy to. More than happy to.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Ben, for today's lecture. It's very inspiring. It's also very important for students who are now taking subject on gender and sexuality and also medical anthropology. It's really combined those 2 subjects into a very interesting talk today. Hopefully to see you again next semester. I hope you don't mind, maybe the Vice Dean actually here listening to your talk, but I can just talk to her whether we can invite you again in the next semester, not only for 1 lecture, but probably 1 semester, full time.
Yeah, I'd love that, of course.
Yeah, we can discuss about it later, okay? So this is not first and last time, but it's only the beginning of your talk at Pajajaran University, and probably we will have you in our class again next semester. But today, thank you very much for your very inspiring talk. See you again very soon and have a good health. Stay healthy there in Melbourne and see you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Ben.
So much. Thank you for having me, Anna. Thanks. Apologies again for cutting it
Ya,
short.
terima
I look forward to
kasih.
seeing everyone. Terima kasih banyak semuanya.
Terima kasih sekali.
Ya, tetap sehat ya.
Ya, keep contact, Ben.
Tetap semangat.
Bye. Terima kasih
banyak.
semuanya.
Bye.
Wassalamualaikum.